Welcome to the very first episode of Know Your Neighbor. This is Crowsdale's first original talk show, and I'm your host, Caroline, from Life Enrichment. We all have histories. Every single person is a library, full of stories that deserve to be told. Each of us is more than who we are in any one specific moment. This time is simply one chapter. Let's take time to sit down together and learn what led up to this page where we are today. So join us every Wednesday and get to know your neighbor. Our inaugural Know Your Neighbor talk show guest is my friend, Ruthann Anderson. Ruthann moved here to Crowsdale Village from Virgilina, Virginia, in January of 2013. In the 7.5 years that my friend Ruthann has been here, you've probably seen her around. She's an avid member of the walking club. You might feel a gust of wind as she speeds by. She's in the Random Acts of Kindness Club and is famous for her homemade peanut butter fudge. Ruthann is also one of the smartest and most selfless people that I've met here at Crowsdale. She's an award-winning author and has written 3 published books. Anyone who knows Ruthann knows for certain one thing. She is an avid animal lover. Just look at her duck face mask that she's wearing today. This love for animals is what we'll be focusing on in our chat today, as Ruthann spent a number of years rehabilitating wild ducks. So without further ado, let's get to know your neighbor. Ruthann, I am so glad you're here. Thank you for being our very first guest.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel so honored being here.
The honor is mine. So I want to start with just a very simple question. We are in the midst of a crazy time right now. 2020 has been a wild year. So I just want to ask, how are you doing?
I'm luckier than most people. I've always been busy all my life. My mother taught me how to do crafts and needlework when I was about 7 or 8 years old. For the past several decades, I have just learned more, done more, and expanded on that. Also, I'm very lucky because I have a cat. I am never alone. Any pet owner is never alone when they have a pet. She's a constant joy and companion.
And you've had pets your whole life, right? I think in your apartment, you have even a photo collage of all the pets you've had over the year.
That's correct. My first experience, I think loving pets is in my genes. My parents were both animal lovers and had a variety of pets of their own. And the first experience I remember is when I was chasing a bumblebee when I was about 2 years old. I was already after the animals. I caught him and he stung me. But my first domestic pet was a beagle puppy. I received him as a gift when I was about 7 years old. And from there, an aunt and uncle of mine gave me a pet for special occasions like birthdays. So because of them, I had turtles, a parakeet, goldfish, tropical fish, and various other assorted pets. And I have just always loved pets. I seem to have some kind of connection with animals. I'm an eye person. I love to look into someone's eyes to see what they're thinking and get to know the real person. And I do that with animals too. And I know that with wild animals, you're not supposed to look into their eyes because many of them take that as a sign of aggression. But I've had no trouble And I think when they look into my eyes, they realize I'm there to help them, not hurt them. And that was a tremendous help when I was rehabilitating wild ducks.
That's incredible. Even as you're talking, I'm just thinking, I'm so glad you're our first guest because this is amazing. And I always love hearing your stories. And you talked about how you've loved animals from a young age, even the ones that maybe stung you or didn't want to be friends right away. And there's even animals here at Crowsdale that are attracted to hanging out with you, right? Doesn't a neighbor cat come visit?
And he loves his mommy. But once he met me, he wants to spend time with me too. So he comes to visit every morning. Either Barbara brings him down or I go pick him up. He comes early in the morning and stays for a few hours.
Well, you are a very welcoming person. I can attest to that. So I don't blame the animals for wanting to be near to you.
I say I have 1.5 cats, and people look at me, how can you have a half a cat? This cat, my neighbor's cat actually has technically 2 homes.
So you mentioned a little bit about growing up in Long Island and how your parents instilled a love of animals in you. Did you have siblings that you played with as well, or were animals sort of a substitute in a funny way?
I never had any siblings. I always wanted a brother and or a sister, and that was not my choice though. So I never had any, and there were no children my age in the neighborhood. So my pets, especially as they started accumulating, were my playmates. My beagle puppy was fortunately very cooperative. He had to come to tea parties for the 2 of us. And when I was in Girl Scouts earning my Girl Scout first aid badge, with some improvisations, I performed CPR on him.
Animals are forgiving companions, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
They let us love on them even if they're not in the mood. So did you ever foresee, when you were a little girl, did you ever foresee a future as an adult working with animals in some capacity, or did you have other ideas of what you might want to do when you grew up?
Animals were always so much a part of my life, wild ones or domestic ones. This beagle puppy, my parents told me, he was my dog. I had to walk him. I walked him faithfully every day, a few times a day. My parents sometimes wish they hadn't told me he was my responsibility because a beagle, with his keen sense of smell, found anything that was injured and at the side of the road. I couldn't leave it there. I had to bring it home. 7, 8, 9, and up, as long as I was home until I went off to college. The neighbors even gave me animals that they found because they knew I would take care of them. And if I couldn't treat it, I wasn't driving yet, but my parents took me to a wildlife preserve. We brought the herd animal there, and they took care of it. And if it couldn't be released, they put it in their animals for people to come and see. They put them in there, show their educational animals.
Wow. So even as a child, you were drawn to animals who needed help.
That's right.
And I think that's really interesting because a lot of kids like their pets when it's fun and new and novel, and they don't like the responsibility that comes with it, much less taking care of another animal who isn't able to be played with but is injured and needs saving and help. I think that's just a testament to your kind-heartedness and your selflessness. And that was just when you were a kid. But later on, you started doing that as a full-time volunteer in helping rehabilitate ducks. If you know Ruthann at all, you know her love of ducks specifically. And in her apartment, she even has a duck statuette who is currently wearing a mask, thankfully. And she has some of her craft work features ducks, and also her mask today, of course. Her email address also refers to her as Duck Lady, so I don't think there's any question if Ruthann likes ducks. When was the first time you remember seeing or encountering ducks? Do you remember a specific time?
Any animal attracts my attention. But I can remember distinctly going on a Girl Scout trip when I don't know if I was in Brownies or Intermediate Scouts, but I was quite young. We went to a duck pond, and the ducks fascinated me. Now fast forward literally several decades. And when my husband and I moved to southeast Georgia, we were 5 minutes from the Florida border. Our house was on a corner directly across the street from a 3-acre lagoon. There were about 100 assorted ducks on the lagoon. Some were there permanently, some flew in and out, some were seasonal. Some were actually domesticated ducks that people bought and put there, and then they had offspring that stayed there. And I knew that being on a street like that, on a corner, cars would be whizzing by and ducks would get hit. Plus, we had a lot of wild animals. There were alligators in the lagoon sometimes. So I tried to find a wildlife rehabilitator, and I found one, and she asked me if I would be her extra pair of hands. You cannot take a wild animal, catch it, examine it, and treat it, and do it all with one pair of hands. You can take a small bird, that's all right. You can usually do that. She took in deer, and she had an otter, and a soft-shelled turtle about this big. You need extra hands for some things like that. Even with me, when I had to take fish hooks out of the ducks, my husband had to help me. Either I held the duck and he cut the fish hook so it could be pulled out carefully and gently, or else he held the duck and I took the fish hook out. And then one day she had asked me, all of her cages were full, and she asked me if I would do the ducks. That would free some of her cages, and that's how I started with ducks.
That's incredible. So you lived in Georgia, across from a lagoon in your neighborhood, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And there were ducks there, like you said, some that had been purchased and placed there, some that had been born into that habitat. And you said cars were whizzing by. It was a dangerous environment for them. And you just sort of took it upon yourself to connect with this duck rehabilitator and learn from her, right? Were you surprised by what you saw in terms of some of the injuries? You mentioned fish hooks being in the ducks. Yeah. And you've shown me pictures of ducks with casts and bandages. What kind of injuries did you see in those ducks in the neighborhood?
Well, I saw all kinds of injuries, and I would treat anything I could, and any wildlife rehabilitator has to have a vet sponsor, so he did the things I couldn't. But the injuries that I saw in the ducks, some were deliberately caused by humans. I can't imagine how anyone would do that, but they did. I saw, of course, the fish hook injuries, car hits, alligator attacks, dog attacks. Some ducks got sick. Some had sprains. They had infections. And ducks that had broken bones or that I knew needed surgery or x-rays, I brought to my vet sponsor, and he took the x-rays, did the surgery, and as soon as the duck woke up, he called me to come down and get the duck, and then I did all the post-op care until the duck could be released.
It's incredible that you, first of all, did this as a volunteer and took it upon yourself to have the vet sponsor and to do the research and even sometimes to pay out of pocket for medication the ducks might need and things like that. And it just shows your passion. And I think that's really incredible. Something I love when you've told me these stories is that it was not a one-way affection from you to the ducks. They also really took to you and felt comfortable with you. You would name them, right, if they came to stay with you. And you had one named Mounds, who especially liked being around you. Tell me about how Mounds, or maybe some of the other ducks, wanted to be near you at all times.
When I was treating a duck, of course I did them outside. And other ducks, we always had a yard full of ducks, the ones, because they would walk across the street and go through the neighborhoods catching insects and eating weeds and plants. So the ducks were familiar with our yard. And Mounds, each duck is like each person. Each one has his own personality. Mounds was a very friendly Muscovy. They're large ducks. The males are about this large, females about that large. And Mounds was one of those super friendly animals. The ducks, when I was treating a duck, the others in his family watched. The duck I was treating showed no signs of stress. They didn't start trying to get away once they learned the system, what I was doing and what I was doing when. I kept things in the same order. And Mounds watched like everyone else, and when they needed help, they would come and look for me. But Mounds, on the other hand, he just wanted to be with me. One day I was bending over in the yard picking up something from the grass, and this lead weight landed on my back. I suspected it was a duck, but I had no idea what it was. I couldn't get up with this weight on my back, but I could see wingtips out here. And I could tell it was definitely a duck, and I suspected it was Mounds. And I had to shake him off, and when he got off my back, it was Mounds. And another time I was sitting in the yard, and he just walked right up on my lap, walked right up the front of me, very gently touched my face, went all around my eyes, my nose, and my mouth. He obviously didn't want to hurt me, but he wanted to find out, what was this stuff? He didn't have the same kind of stuff.
Where were your feathers?
And he went all through my hair. He must have thought, those are funny kind of feathers. And after a while, if he just saw me walk through the yard, he would either land on my shoulder. If I bent over, he'd be on my back. If I sat down, he'd be in my lap. And that's just the way he was. The other ducks, some were more friendly than others, but there was only one Mounds.
And even a whole gaggle of ducks. I don't know, is that the correct term what's the term for a group of ducks?
Flock, whatever.
A flock, okay. You showed me a picture. This was one of my favorites in your archives of your front screen door at your house. And if you look out that door, there was a whole flock of ducks. Looked like they were showing up for a dinner party or something. They knew which house was yours in the neighborhood, right?
Oh, yes. There were several instances where a duck was badly injured from whatever reason. And they would actually come. They knew I helped them. And even though they didn't like what I was doing, they didn't like taking oral medicine twice a day. They certainly didn't like having their wounds. They were torn open at times. They didn't like having those wounds washed. It must have hurt. But yet they put up with it, and they knew they would eventually get better. That was another kind of injury I saw. Turtle bites. The ducks would be swimming, a snapping turtle would come up and just take a big bite out of the front of them. And those take a while to heal and had to be treated for infection, cleaned every day.
You really earned the trust not only of the ducks that you saved, but like you said, also their families and other ducks who witnessed the care that you took. That's really amazing.
And this was a 24/7 volunteer job, but I have to tell you about one of the many funny things that happened while I was treating the ducks. Both the vet and I kept detailed records about the care we gave the ducks, and I also included the ducks' favorite food, what they did like or didn't like. And in order to do that, each duck had to have either a name or a number. I don't like giving living things numbers. And I wouldn't remember that this duck in particular was a number 7 or a number 15 or whatever. So I gave them names based on their personality or their coloring. And one duck that had to go to the vet didn't have a name yet. The vet asked me what the duck's name was so he could fill out the chart. And I said, well, he doesn't have a name. Do you have any suggestions? I said, I haven't treated this one before. And he said, well, it isn't very dignified, but how about Poops? This duck had a very active recycling system to recycle what he had eaten. And the vet gave me the veterinary medicines that he had on hand, but sometimes ducks needed human medicine. So those were at my expense. I had to go to Walmart. Well, I turned in the prescription the one time for Poops and dropped the prescription off, and they said they'd call when it was ready. All of a sudden, a few minutes later, I heard over the loudspeaker, prescription ready for Poops Anderson.
And you said, that's me, I'm picking up for Poops Anderson.
Everybody in the store that heard it was in hysterics.
I cannot believe you haven't told me that story before.
There are so many stories.
That is incredible. So you would name the ducks, you would care for them, your husband even would help you build kind of cages for them.
He built the cages, yeah.
So after you rehabilitated a duck like Poops or Mounds, what was the process for getting them back to the lake?
Usually, most of them were releasable, either that or they didn't make it at all, and some had to be put down because they were never going to have a decent life. Once they were released, I just basically put them down on the ground and they joined their friends. Some of them I carried over to the lake or the lagoon and put them down there, but that was the easy part. And they were familiar with the neighborhood. They knew how to find food and where to find it.
I bet it gave them comfort after they were back at the lagoon after being healed to then see you around the neighborhood. I think that's really neat. You had mentioned getting to know the ducks when they stayed with you, from giving them names to knowing what their favorite food was. What do ducks eat? That might be a basic question, but I find myself wondering.
Different kinds of ducks eat different foods. Some ducks eat fish. Most, or probably all of them, eat some plants. And the animals learn from each other. I noticed when I was watching the ducks at the lagoon that one time there were some young ducks and people had thrown bread into the lagoon. And the youngest ducks went to eat it. And the teenage ducks went and slapped them on the backs with their bill, like, don't do that. And the younger ducks looked at them like, as if say, well, why not? That's good food. And the teenage ducks showed them that, no, you let the bread float on the water. When the fish come to eat the bread, then you catch the fish. And when you catch the fish, don't eat it in the water. Bring it up on land before you eat it, because if you drop the fish or he wiggles out of your mouth, you can still pick him up. If you drop the fish in the water, he'll swim away.
Wow, I never knew that about feeding bread to the ducks. I will have to watch more closely next time I do that and see if they use it as a trap to catch fish.
When I had the ducks in cages, I had to supply all their food. I knew from watching the ducks what their favorite plants were. I put a potted plant. Monkey grass was one of their favorite foods. All the ducks seemed to like to eat that. I had 2 pots of that, and I put one in the cage, and the ducks would eat it right down to an inch above the soil. And then I'd take that plant out and put the other one in and let the first one regrow. I also picked weeds from our garden and fed it to the ducks, put them in the cage. And I fed so many ducks weeds that we ran out of weeds, and I asked the neighbor if they would let me pick weeds from their garden. They said, go ahead, take as many as you want. We don't want them anyway.
I'm sure your neighbors would be glad to get rid of their weeds. And also, I think if I were a duck that you were rehabilitating, I don't know if I would want to go back to the lagoon. It sounds like they got to live in the lap of luxury with you, Ruthann.
They also cleaned out the cobwebs. They knew from experience that cobwebs collect insects overnight. So every morning the ducks would go around the entire neighborhood cleaning out the cobwebs that were supposed to, that the spiders plan on eating those insects, but the ducks ate them first, and they ate the spiders too. When I had some ducks with particular problems, I had 2 ducks with broken backs and 2 with broken necks. The broken neck ones, the one duck didn't make it, the other one made a full recovery. But he had a cast that went from right behind his ears down to the top of his back. He couldn't move at all. He was paralyzed. So he just had to lay in a padded cage. He had to eat, and he couldn't get the cast wet. Well, I went back to the store and found a denture cream to keep your dentures in and coated the front of his cast with that because it was non-toxic and waterproof, and that would keep his cast dry. And I mixed food for him in a little yogurt container. Because he couldn't swallow well, I mixed chicken scratch, a crushed grain of different types, plants, dirt. Ducks have to eat dirt. It helps them grind the food up in their gizzards. And I mixed all this into what I called a duck Slurpee. And I held the yogurt cup in front of him, and he put his bill in it, and he just slurped away.
He loved it.
And then he couldn't get wet but wanted a bath, so I did the same thing, but I put just water in this yogurt cup. And he would splash, get his whole face wet, and he'd just flap with his wings this way, just as if he was splashing in the water in the lagoon.
Wow, you had to do some really innovative thinking to tackle some of these challenges that the ducks were facing, and I think that's really incredible and admirable. Well, I had mentioned earlier that you are a woman of many talents. I'm sure people will be calling you for your peanut butter fudge after this episode, but I mentioned that writing is a gift of yours as well, and I know from experience, since we're friends, that you are a wonderful poet. I love hearing your rhymes. And I asked you to bring one today. Can you tell us, before you read that poetry, a little bit about the works that you've published? You have 3 books, as well as 9, I believe, poetry booklets for children, adults, seniors. Tell us a little bit more about your career as an author.
Well, as far as poetry, I wrote one poem in college. It just came to me in the middle of the night. And I wrote the words to our class song. Each class had their own song. That was the beginning of writing in verse. And then one of our cats, beloved cat, needed surgery. This was maybe 15 years ago. And he did not wake up. Surgery was over. He did fine, but he did not wake up. So we lost him, and it was heartbreaking. About 2 weeks later, a poem about him, a full-page poem, came to me in the middle of the night. I wrote it down, and that was the beginning of me writing many poems. I have written over 600 poems, and I have also written over 100 verses for greeting cards. I used to sell greeting cards in the gift shop in a museum in Virginia.
That's incredible. And I, as a lover of poetry, am a fan of your work. Would you mind reading a poem for us now?
I'd be happy to. I have, as Caroline said, I have 9 different poem booklets. Each one is about a different subject. This one is titled Poems for the Young and Young at Heart.
We are definitely young at heart.
And I've chosen one, the poem to read today is called Duck Days. Rain, rain, and more rain. Every day it's the same. Soon we'll have to build a boat just so we can stay afloat. My toes are going to become webbed, and I'll grow feathers on my head. When you turn and talk to me, a feathered duck is what you'll see. I'll be quacking alongside the street, looking for something good to eat. I'll splash about in every puddle, and I'll be too wet to cuddle. Maybe someday the rain will quit, and we will no longer have to sit on the inside looking out. We'll be out there running about.
So much, Ruthann.
You're welcome. I used to do school programs either about being a wildlife rehabilitator or being an author or a poet. And that's when I came out with this booklet, because I always left something there in the school after the program was over.
From speaking in schools to being the inaugural guest on our talk show, we are so glad you're here, Ruthann. It was an honor to have you as our very first guest. And I know that everyone who already has the pleasure of knowing you here at Crowsdale will enjoy hearing some of these stories. And those who haven't had the chance to meet you yet, I'm sure will be seeking you out after hearing today about everything you've done. You are such an integral part of the Crowsdale family, and I'm lucky to call you a friend. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to our very first episode of Know Your Neighbor. I'd like to thank Denise for encouraging this idea, and also Krissa for being our producer, running the cameras, helping us set up. We couldn't do it without the entire team and also all of our residents here at Crowsdale. We love you, and we'll see you next week.